This is Philosophy Bites with me, Nigel Warburton.
And me, David Edmonds.
If you enjoy Philosophy Bites, please support us. For details, go to www.philosophybites.com.
When we think of democracy, we tend to think of parliaments, political parties, election campaigns, speeches and rallies, and so on. All part of the public domain. Robert Talisse believes that democracy should also contain a private or solitary component.
Robert Talisse, welcome to Philosophy Bites.
Hi Nigel, thank you for having me.
The topic we're going to focus on is civic solitude. What is that?
I think that there are distinctive duties that are civic that can be discharged only in isolation from others.
That's interesting because generally when we think of civic duties, they're collective. There's a sense of a group of people combining to take some kind of action.
Yeah, and there's good reason for that. Democracy, after all, is about collective self-government. It's about holding government to account. It's about civic responsibility, which is often collective. Turns out, though, that those collective public faces of our civic duties are not exhaustive. Democracy, in being a system by which we rule collectively as political equals, requires of us that we understand one another. And it turns out that collective public democratic action can obstruct our ability to understand one another.
So I'm imagining people turning out for a general election. They all are in the streets queuing up to put a cross on a ballot paper. They're collectively expressing their will. What could possibly go wrong with them doing it collectively? Surely they can't do it individually.
Right. Well, what can go wrong is what brought them to the political views that they're trying to express. We are groupish creatures. This is not an uncommon thought. And our groupishness, in part, requires us to draw boundaries between the in-group and the out-group. Turns out that ruling together as political equals requires us to be able to do what we can to understand our fellow citizens' perspectives, points of view, their priorities, and the collective public activity that we are called upon to engage in as democratic citizens can distort our conception of what our fellow citizens' views are.
So is your point that genetically, historically, we've evolved as animals in small groups, and those groups put pressure on us to conform, and somehow we lose our sense of individuality, our sense of what really matters because of the rhetoric of the group, as it were?
I think that's part of the story. There's another dimension to it, though, where part of how the in-group, out-group dynamic stuff works, and part of why it's distorting, is because of a phenomenon that many listeners might be familiar with called group polarization, where when we interact only with people who are members of our in-group, we grow more and more inclined to adopt increasingly extreme and negative attitudes towards people we perceive to be out-group members.
So within our echo chamber, we all agree, and then everybody else must be the enemy, like football supporters who are all Chelsea supporters, hating Spurs supporters.
That's right. I think the stadium analogy, is a really good way of capturing intuitively what the phenomenon is. However, notice another aspect of it. It's that group polarization also leads us to treat our allies badly because we come to see them merely as people who are accomplices rather than fellow citizens whose views might diverge from our own. So the thing about group polarized collectives is that they become more internally conformist, more insisting on conformity within the in-group, and more inclined to dismiss in-group members for even minor deviations from the party line.
That's strange. Why would I treat an ally as merely a means to an end when treating them better would presumably make them a better ally and actually indirectly produce a better end?
Oh, yeah, I don't think this dynamic is rational. I think you're exactly right that it's an irrational dynamic, especially in politics. Right? If you want to accomplish something in democratic politics, you have to join a choir and you have to build the choir, right? Turns out, though, that these dynamics become more and more homogenizing. And so you could see this even in the sports analogy. People who show up for a sports game do a lot of prep before they show up in the stadium to dress alike. They learn a common chants, common gestures. And if you don't know the gestures and the chants, people start looking at you like you're not an authentic fan. So part of the group polarization phenomenon is about not only marking a divide between the in-group and the out-group, but enforcing a kind of authenticity among the in-group.
It sounds like you're arguing against party politics, because many countries have parties. I think most, if not all, who have democracies have parties, and you vote for a party, not just for an individual. And being a member of a party comes with a colour, a set of rosettes, a kind of set of values. It seems hard to avoid that in democracy.
Oh, I think it is hard to avoid it. And I think it is destructive in the following sense. So in the United States, just to give some examples, we have an entire idiom for calling out members of our own party who we think are fakes. Rhino and Dino, Republican in name only and Democrat in name only. It's a perfect example of this. Now, note, all it takes to get sort of labeled as an in name only is just a deviation from the party line. I think it's very destructive for political movements to be so interested in conformity. I think it's very bad for democratic politics. So I think you're right that the reliance on parties in democratic politics sets up this dynamic for the parties to become more and more homogeneous. I think that as political agents, we owe it to the project of democracy to try to counteract that.
So is this a sociological point, anthropological point, or is it a kind of structural thing about democracy? Inevitably, it tends towards this self-destructive groupthink.
I think the latter. I think that there is, within democracy, which I'm a Democrat, I'm a democratic believer, right? But within democracy, there are tendencies that lead to its own undermining. This is not an uncommon phenomenon. There are lots of things that we value that have sort of some vulnerability baked into the sauce, as it were. It turns out that in democracy, the activities that we are required to engage in as good democratic citizens, joining a collective, getting on board with the priorities and the aims of the collective, acting in public for the sake of advancing justice as our group sees it, these are all essential democratic activities. Turns out that in the absence of other kinds of practices, they can become pathological.
So are you saying this is something that's just happened, or has this always been there in democracy?
Well, I think it's always been a potential vulnerability of democracy. I think that the obvious culprits these days, the internet, social media, where we've become more and more able with greater and greater ease to project our political identities, our party affiliations, to organize online communities around party affiliation to the exclusion of all else, has exacerbated these problems and made these vulnerabilities much more salient.
Now, to play devil's advocate, if the alternative is for people to get out of groupthink and think as autonomous individuals, that's going to be pretty weird, because we are social animals. Even philosophers don't just get their ideas from nowhere. They interact with other philosophers and other people, thinkers of the past. You can't be just an isolated individual rationally discovering the right way to vote like a mathematician working out set theory in a private room.
I agree with you. So what I'm calling civic solitude is a set of practices that need to be engaged in addition to some of the collective public things that the deliberative Democrats and participatory Democrats have been talking about and advocating. I'm on their side. Just think that when that is done and understood as the whole of our civic duties, it turns pathological. Now, secondly, part of what I'm arguing is that democratic citizens need spaces and occasions for a kind of detached reflection. I think that that detached reflection has to get its content from sources of political thinking that are not readily translated into the language of contemporary partisan divides. So ultimately, I want to say, part of what democratic citizens need to do is occasionally go to the library and read some political thinking that is not of our time and our place and our circumstance. It might be a civic duty to sit back and read Aristotle every now and then.
This reminds me of something that crops up every now and then in British politics, the suggestion there should be a test that people take to show they're above a threshold of understanding of politics before they're allowed to vote. And that's a very divisive, dangerous route to go down.
Oh, I agree. So I'm not advocating for any of that. So this is a proposal that's simply aimed at, if you are a citizen who takes democratic politics seriously, wants to advance justice as you can best understand it in the world, you have to do all the partisan and participatory things that we are accustomed to thinking that citizens must do. But there's also a requirement that's additionally a solitary, reflective, contemplative activity that asks you to step back, get a little bit of distance from the fray, and consider how your political ideas play in conversation with a political opponent who's not a member of your contemporary political world. Let me just give you one sort of kind of example that I think can be helpful here. Aristotle gives a 2-sentence argument against elections as democratic instruments. He says, in a democracy, you shouldn't choose holders of public office by elections. Elections are oligarchic. It's 2 sentences. By the way, it's not very hard to get the gist of the argument either. So you don't have to be an Oxford philosopher, right, to understand like why someone might think that. Elections are anti-democratic instruments. What's, I think, important about that argument is that if you don't like it, you can't rely on your partisan reflexes to say what's wrong with it. Your favorite political commentator, so in the States, your favorite Fox News commentator isn't going to tell you what's wrong with Aristotle's critique of elections. Rachel Maddow doesn't have the soundbite ready to teach you how to react to that. You have to engage in some thinking on your own about what elections are, how they're used in democracy, why they're so central to our democratic thinking. And that kind of exploration of our own political ideas, I think, is really, really important for democratic citizenship, especially given the fact that our politics, especially, but not only in the United States, are now so toxic that you can't rely on your fellow citizens to play devil's advocate with you.
In lots of areas in life, there's a division of labour. We can't all be scientists, we can't all be doctors, although lots of people with Google think they can. What's wrong with me as a Democrat, a democratic citizen, from outsourcing some of my thinking to somebody who I trust?
Well, there might not be anything wrong with that. However, when our politics or democratic politics have gotten to the point where the most likely voices to whom we might offload our responsibilities in the ways that and defer to in the ways that you're suggesting, do more to demonize the other side than to make a positive case for a particular political program, I think that has anti-democratic potential. As democratic citizens, we owe something to one another because we're supposed to be able to recognize one another as civic equals. And when our politics is organized around what's sometimes called negative partisanship, don't make the case for your own project. You just make the case for thinking that the other guys are the end of democratic politics or are enemies of the country or whatever kind of language you want to use. I think that when we're encouraged to see those with whom we disagree as necessarily divested from democracy as such, I think democracy falters. And if we're deferring to people who give us that message, I think we're falling short of our civic duties.
You've chosen to use the word solitude, but it seems to me what you're advocating is more a reflective attitude that doesn't necessarily require solitude.
It doesn't necessarily require solitude. However, practically it does, for the following reason. In the United States and in elsewhere throughout Europe, throughout the well-developed democracies in Europe, public spaces have become saturated with calls to partisanship. In the United States today, not only in the United States today, where you buy your groceries, where you buy your coffee in the morning, what kind of car you drive, what kind of occupation you work at, where you live, even within large cities like Manhattan and New York, are all hives for co-partisans. Shopping at Whole Foods is a partisan-coded activity. Partisanship is correlated with how much time you spend in a park. Liberals are much more likely to be in parks than conservatives. If you're a conservative, you're much more likely to vacation close to a lake where there's fishing. In other words, it's not merely just Walmart versus Target, which is also heavily partisan coded in the United States. It's not just yoga pants versus camouflage. In all of these senses, the partisan sorting of social spaces in democracies means that The ordinary places that we might go to adopt this reflective stance are already sort of saturated with triggers to our worst partisan reflexes. That's why I think contingently it takes solitude.
And what if a skeptic says the library where you're sending these people is also coded? That's a liberal coded place.
People do say that to me. And what I want to suggest is that's not the objection. That is a symptom of the problem, that even an institution like a public library now has to be understood as a fundamentally partisan space, only shows how deep the problem runs.
Let's say people listening to this podcast all nod their heads wisely and say, yes, he's so right. You're so right, Socrates. Let's all go down that route. How will the world be transformed?
Well, so there's a problem, toxicity in our politics that emerges from the sort of centering of partisanship and partisan divides in our democracy. What I want to suggest is that the first step that we might take is to reorient our conception of our civic duties to include these more reflective kinds of activities. Understand that those kinds of reflective activities need some distance from the partisan fray, and it's very hard to get the required distance. But then here's the immediate upshot. Seeing spaces that allow for that kind of contemplative activity as democratically necessary civic spaces is the immediate upshot. In the U.S., not only the U.S., public libraries are first on the chopping block when financial times get tough, even in New York City. All right? Parks, public places where people can be alone with their own thoughts, places that are not suffused with advertisements, for example, places where people can think in quiet. These are understood as luxuries, as community amenities. I think one immediate upshot of the civic solitude argument is that we have to start thinking about public museums, public parks, public libraries, as well as other kinds of public spaces as democratically essential spaces.
So would it be fair to summarize what you're saying as, in contrast with Plato, who thought that philosophers should rule, philosopher kings and queens, you think citizens should be philosophers?
Exactly. I'll own that. I think that it's good for democracy if Calciprice, a philosopher, saying, yeah, reading Aristotle is good for you as a democratic citizen. I'll own it, yeah.
Bob Talisse, thanks very much.
Thank you, Nigel. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
For more Philosophy Bites, go to www.philosophybites.com. You can also find details there of Philosophy Bites books and how to support us.